All right, and we're live. So, name of the game is local servers. So we're talking about how we use them, why we use them, what they're for, all that kind of stuff. So to start with, why don't you hit me with some questions? What are some questions you have about anything having to do with local servers?
How do you find the IP address of a website?
Beautiful.
Like, for example, fordcredit.com.
How?
Yeah, we were working on finding it, and we did, what the thread ended up getting to, that remote address, dropping the 443, and we still kept getting an error for Ford.com. So I don't know if it's just Ford's website or what, but we'll take a look at it together and we'll see.
Is it possible that when you're plugging in those IP addresses that there's some sort of security that's stopping us from doing that? Because I noticed that with a few other websites.
Depending on the site you were using, what I saw, like if you used like Ford's site or something you had to sign into, if you just took that IP address and tried to plug it in, it's saying, hey, you're taking an IP address from a secure site and trying to plug it into an unsecure browser, is what it was saying.
Yeah, it kept telling me my browser was unsecured. Hackers are trying to get my information. I'm like, no, I'm trying to do a project. Help me, man. But yeah, that's what we were running into.
And I've tried pinging it through the command line and also doing the NS lookup. And the addresses that it was coming up with, it didn't work when I tried to copy and paste them.
Yeah, so we tried to be cheeky. We said, what website do you...
I figured it out.
All right, lay it on us.
All right, if this works. Oh, come on. Oh, shoot, come on. Oh, no, you wouldn't be able to do that. How do you do a subdomain with that? Interesting. I think that's
drop
the
off
issue.
the www.
Yeah, since the host is www.ford.com, as hopefully you took away from the reading, the subdomain is like a totally separate site. And so www.ford.com is not the same as ford.com. Now, the way that almost everybody does that is you redirect one to the other. So like if I type in ford.com, it probably redirects me. Like that. But you see how it added the subdomain? That like it moved me. A lot of sites will do that the other way around, where if you type www, it drops it, redirects you to the subdomain without it. So there you go. No, so that error, this one, you got to the server. Like that counts.
Okay.
Okay.
Like this server this error isn't coming from your browser. That's coming from Ford.
That is so relieving to hear.
Christopher, we had it.
We did have it. We were both like, oh my gosh, like we feel so stupid right now. Can't figure it out. All the advice we're getting is like telling us what we already did. So, all right, cool. Good to know.
So we look at the status on this. We got a response, which means that there was somebody waiting on the other end of that to respond to it, and told us that they didn't like the way that we requested it. That sort of tracks. Because like you can see whether or not somebody requested the domain or the IP address. And so maybe somebody at Ford was like, if they're requesting it by the IP address, maybe that's capital S, suspicious. And then they 400 it.
Okay.
An experiment that Scott and Sean and myself did with Weather Channel was if you go to the Weather Channel, it's if you look up the network tab, it's weather.com. We tried that IP, doesn't work. But if you do like NS lookup and do weatherchannel.com, it gives you the correct IP and it redirects you to that specific website.
Nice.
Super strange.
Yeah, same thing. I'll bet that's an Apache default. In fact, it might even be on the response. So So what I'm looking for is a response thing. So there you go. What kind of server it is? It's Akamai. Akamai is what's called a CDN. What they do is you upload content one time to Akamai, and then Akamai puts it on servers all over the world. And then when you request something from that site, Akamai figures out which server is just geographically closest to you, and then serves you the content from there. So theoretically, you're getting a faster response. But I'll bet that's 100% what's happening there is if Akamai is blocking the trying to get to the site by the IP address. Because like there's no legitimate reason to do that. Like I sort of get it other than like a class project. But yeah, that's what's happening there. All right, what are your other localhost questions? Servers.
I have a question. So the benefits of using a local server, if there is any, versus like using live server on VS Code.
Sure. Benefits of light server. Other questions?
Just a general go ahead.
I want to hear from Sarah.
When asking about like the scheme, like what kind of scheme it's using, I don't understand that. Is there any way you can share more about it?
Totally. So that's parts of the URL. Other questions? These are great.
I was just going to say just a general overview of light servers as well, the benefits too, but just in general because the concept's not sticking with me right now.
Sure. How to use it. What else?
Can we go over, excuse me, I guess I don't really know how to ask it, other than that last question regarding with the folder structure and how would it look like if the root of the folder were served up on a local host?
Yeah.
Right? Sorry, I don't know how to ask that correctly. Hope you got that.
No, I think I followed it.
Okay.
So.
Because the pathways look different, I'd imagine, on the local host.
Sure.
Than not.
So I'm going to call that constructing a URL.
Okay.
Other questions? All right. So to start with, let me show you a diagram. We call this the client-server diagram. That's the client. It makes a request to a server. Server sends back the response. This pattern shows up over and over and over again in software. We call it client-server. So like that seems like pretty straightforward. So here's the mind-blowing part. It's contextual. Who is the client and who is the server? That's not like a specific fixed role. A client is someone who requests something. A server is someone who responds to something. That's it. So the same computer can be a server in one context and a client in a different context. For example, if I have a chain of these where this client here makes a request to this server, but to fulfill that, this server needs to make a request to this server. So for the first one, that's the client and that's the server. For the second one, that's the client, that's the server. Client is somebody who's requesting something. Server, someone who's responding to something. Ask me some questions about that.
So like the building that got bombed and AT&T went down for a few days because it was a big hub of servers. Those are client and servers because they accept our request and they send back stuff.
No, so accepting a request and sending back stuff, those are both server tasks. Now, they might be clients if that server needed to get something from another server. For example, you might request some data from a server, but then that server needs to get it from a database. When it's getting it from the database, like if this is a database, that's an API. This is a browser. Browser requests data from an API. The API needs to get the data from a database. So the browser is the client requesting something from a server. The API is a client requesting something from the database.
So to take that to a slightly different scale, you said that your own machine can be the client and the server.
Bingo! That's where we're going with this.
Okay.
So this is a conceptual mental model. They don't even need to refer to discrete computers, like physical machines. This can be happening inside of your computer also. Pattern is exactly the same. You can request something, the server responds with something. So if the client is my browser and the server is lite-server, that still works, and I didn't need to get a separate computer to test that this whole flow works correctly. Now, specifically, server can mean a lot of different things. Some different kinds of servers. File. It's like Google Drive. Just keeps a bunch of files. You can request a file, get the contents of the file back. Email servers. These work at a lower level of the internet, not really a web thing specifically, but they're listening for those email protocol requests. They're storing the emails. They can respond to requests for emails, all that kind of stuff. That's an email server. You'd have a print server. Connected to a printer, you want to print something, you ask the print server takes care of it for you. API is access to data. So if you want just some raw data, you ask the API gives it back to you. So all of these are different types of server. lite-server in particular is a file server. You go to some folder that has some files, you run lite-server, you have turned that folder into a server that you can make requests to with a browser. So let's see it. If I go to, oh, I know. All right, so here's a folder with just some web stuff. It's got an index.html, it's got an index.js, it's got an index.css. Nothing up this sleeve, nothing up this sleeve. So if I run lite-server on this folder, oops, nope, npx lite-server, it was the way that you installed lite-server was super different like a year or two ago, and it's way better now, especially for learning it. But I still got used to it. All right, so I run npx lite-server. All right, and there's the site. So what this did was it took that folder and made it the root of this server. It's hosting it here. So I can go to that URL in the browser and see that site. My browser doesn't know or give a shit that this is also on my computer. It could be in China. It could be down the street. It could be in Ford's data center. All it knows is I gave it a URL, and that URL is currently pointing to that folder.
Would that command still work if you didn't have any of the files in there? Like, so if I had a completely empty directory and I still did npx lite-server, it'd just portray a blank screen in my browser?
Yeah, so let's see what that would look like. There's a very particular thing that would happen that some of you have probably already seen. All right, so I make an empty folder. Nothing up this sleeve, nothing up this sleeve. I lite-servered that. Oop, come on, man. Cannot get root. So here's like, here's the next part of that. If we look at the server logs for that, someone requested the path index.html. Obviously, it didn't find it. And so it gave a 404 back indicating that it was not able to find that file. So if I kill that, and I don't even have to put anything in it. If I just put an index.html file in here and then serve it up, watch this. Blank. I didn't get anything, but I didn't get that error. And if I look at my server log, I got a 200, which means that it was able to find the file. All this is doing is making it so that you can get the contents of files in a browser. Hell, even if I didn't put any HTML in there, if I just did some text. Run lite-server. Ta-da. It's just the contents of a file. Now, if I format it like HTML, my browser goes, oh, cool, I know how HTML works, and then like formats it and renders it and does all that kind of stuff. All it's doing is serving up files, though. Questions?
I'm curious. Oh, go ahead.
No, I'm still thinking how to word it. Go ahead.
I was just wondering, this might be completely off, but would this be considered a virtual machine since it works like a server, but it's in a folder on your machine?
It's overselling it. So
okay.
A virtual machine has its own memory and its own CPU, even if they're fake. lite-server doesn't have any of that.
Gotcha.
All it's doing is making it so that if your browser makes a request to that URL, it sees a fake server. So it's closer to a program than a virtual machine.
Okay. Curtis, if you're done, I was going to ask my question then. But, okay. I kind of understand what's going on with lite-servers.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, why would you use this as opposed to just going to the site itself? Because if it's to display it in your browser, couldn't you just enter the website's domain and get there just the same?
Ooh,
like, well, I guess what is the purpose of lite-server?
So here's the reason that we do that. In practice, what you end up doing is, if I go back to that change the Pokemon thing. And serve that up. All right, so I've got that going. See that over there. See that over here. All right, so like what you do when you're developing a site is I want to be watching this in like one split, for example. And then over here, I want to be able to make a change. And then whenever I save it, I want to see it reflected in the browser right away. If I'm on the deployed site, I need to redeploy it every time I want to see a change. This, I can see the change every time I save.
What about just going to lite-server when you're in VS Code?
So lite-server solves the exact same problem. It is not quite as elegant a solution as lite-server. And I think the logs are a lot better on lite-server for debugging. It can also be used in lighter production circumstances also. So for example, lite-server powers part of my local server for CCAT Educate for the LMS. And it also uses that when it's actually running live on the production site. So then I'm using the exact same tool locally that I am on the production server, and that's generally speaking a good idea.
All right, thank you. I gotta turn on my light. I didn't realize how dark it was in here.
This explains so much during the pre-work because I have a NAS and I was doing like what you're doing here, side by side, changing things. And then when I was ready to share it with people, I gave them my local address and they're like, I can't see anything.
Yep.
So that took a while to figure out what the hell was going on with that.
And so this says like external here. It's external in a very particular way. Can anybody figure out what it is? Just based on that IP address?
Your public
port number?
It's not public, really.
It's within your local network. So
Ding,
like
ding, ding.
if I had my iPhone on the same network, I could pull that up theoretically.
Ding, 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 ding. All right, let's see if it works. I got another computer right here. Oops. It's not localhost, 192, 168, 0, 150. I can't see myself. Hang on. There you go. I just went to the same, to that external IP address. So this is super handy for testing things like mobile styles. Go there in your mobile browser and it'll refresh in real time as you're working on the site. Pretty cool. All right, so back to these questions. So how to use lite-server? It's an NPX lite-server. The thing that's really easy to screw up on this is it's like in this case, all right, awesome. It's just the root of the project folder. That's not always the case though. For example, if I wanted to do that with the LMS, like this is the root of the project folder on that. That's not the thing that I want to serve up. If I do that, cool, it all falls apart because there's not an index HTML file here. I probably have some permissions things that are like stopping it from running. So what I need to do is find the one that has that index HTML file, which is right there. So let me create it real quick. Okay, so that's going to generate an HTML file for me. Here's another connection that you should make while it's doing that. Notice that it requested the index.html file, even though that's not actually what I asked for. Why is that the case? I didn't ask for any file. What's the deal there?
Is it because that's what the browser wants?
Kinda, sorta. It's actually the server that's determining that, but more than anything, it's just a convention. Why is that a request for the index.html file at localhost port 3001? It's taking so long. So, back over here. All right, so when I serve this up, it says that I requested the index.html file, but I don't see that anywhere here. In fact, if I do request the index.html file, it works the exact same way. What gives, man? So, the term index gets used a lot in this kind of information system. By this kind of information system, I mean the web. But if you just request the root, it assumes that you mean a file called index.html. That's just a convention that is followed throughout the web. Any path, really, if I do some cool path here, that is going to look for a folder called some cool path, and it's going to look for a file called index.html inside of there. Now, in reality, it actually, like most servers, rewrite those things and do a whole lot of like voodoo and magic to figure out which file that you actually want. But the takeaway that I want you to have is if you don't ask for anything, you're asking for index.html. So that's why.
Is there a way to ask for something specific?
Yep. Type it out. So if I wanted to get this index.js file directly, index.js. Hey, and there it is. What about the CSS file? Hey, there it is.
So you have to do that from your browser. Can you do that via lite-server on the command line?
Lite-server is just serving it up. It's serving it up so that you can access it with a browser. That's the whole point.
There's no way to make changes to those documents. It's only displaying them, right? Like
Correct.
You can't. Okay.
I requested the contents of that file and they were sent to me. Other questions about this? That's using it. Talked about the benefits of it. Talked about how to find an IP address. So let's talk about the URL pieces of it. I think like localhost in particular trips people up on that. Let's do a round robin. So I'm looking for different parts of a URL. Bryce, give me one part of a URL.
We could, well, the start of URL, the HTTPS.
Which is called the?
Hypertext Transfer Protocol.
Oop, that's what that acronym stands for. What part of the URL is it?
All
right, somebody help Bryce out. Shout it out.
That the scheme?
That's the scheme. Bryce, what is that protocol up front called?
The Hypertext Transfer Protocol.
I
the
just
scheme?
told you, and I wrote it on the screen.
Scheme. Oh, scheme. Sorry.
Yeah, there we go. All right, so That's called the scheme. It could be HTTP, it could be HTTPS, it could be FTP, it could be SMTP. Whole lot of protocols that you could put there. The part of the URL that is the scheme. Cool. Next part of a URL. It could be any part of the URL. Sarah, give me another part of a URL.
I have no idea. Domain name?
Sure, love it. Some domain .com. All right, so that's the domain. All right, another part of the URL. I want to hear from Matt C.
Subdomain.
Beautiful. What's the subdomain?
www.
Sure. So anything that comes before there is a subdomain. You don't have to have a subdomain. Lots of things don't. But if you want to have logical subdivisions of a site that your browser treats as completely independent sites, put them on a subdomain. The www thing was a convention that was popular in the early web. It doesn't mean anything. It is just a subdomain. Cool. I want another part of the URL. I want to hear from Parnell.
Subdirectory?
Subdirectory. When we're talking about it in terms of a URL, that's called the, starts with the P.
I have no idea.
Some directory. All right, someone help Parnell out. What's that part of it called?
Path.
Path. Very nice. Parnell, what's that part of the URL called?
A path.
Path. There we go. So it could be to a specific file, like index.html. If it doesn't point to a specific file, then it's expected to be a directory with an index.html in it. In practice, it's a little more interesting than that, but that is theory-wise how that shakes out. All right, another part of the URL I want to hear from Brad.
A port name?
Yeah, port number. So like 80. So if you just put HTTP in here and leave the port off, it is assumed to be port 80. If you do HTTPS and leave the port off, it is assumed to be 443. If you want it to be basically anything else, you have to put it in the URL. And so most of the time, we don't really do that. Like you don't type that out in your browser at least. But when we're doing localhost, we have ports on there because you can have more than one of them. You can be hosting 17 different instances of lite-server, each of which is on a different port. So you see it a lot there, and you see it a lot when you're doing this kind of stuff. Because this server might have a bunch of different, you can think of them as like mailboxes. So if the IP address is like, where's the building? That building, it's like an apartment building maybe, and it's got 50 different mailboxes in it. Those are ports. Where you run into them on lite-server is you'll generally automatically get allocated one. And if I start another one, like in a different site, maybe here, the CSS box model one. If I lite-server that one's on 3003. That one's on 3001. Can run them both at the same time. Okay, starting to flesh this out a little bit. That was subdomain and port. And this is the path. Cool. Another part of a URL, AMP.
Wouldn't it be the IP address?
So
or the URL?
The IP address is a nickname for the domain. So you would either do the IP address or the domain, but you wouldn't do both.
Okay.
But I'm going to put it on there all the same. Because if you were doing an IP address, the rest of it works the same. Like, for example, localhost is a nickname for, anybody remember?
Your network?
What is the IP address of that?
127.0.0.1.
Beautiful. Hey, works the same way. So instead of the domain, we could also do IP address. And you can put paths and stuff on that too. Another part of a URL, Sean.
Another part to the URL. You know, I have no shame in saying it. I don't know any other parts to the URL.
Excellent. We've got 2 more at the end. Who can help Sean out?
A fragment?
Fragment. Sean, do you know what a fragment is?
No.
All right. Be prepared to learn. So fragment, very last part of a URL, starts with the hash, and you put an ID on it. So anybody know what a fragment does?
I can read it right off the web page.
All right, hit me.
It will scroll the page to the first element that has the fragment and its ID attribute.
Ta-da! So this is another use of IDs in HTML. If you want to link to a specific part of a page, you use the fragment. So this is really common in documentation. So if I go over to MDN, and over to color scheme, and I really want to send somebody right to this syntax thing. Take a look at the URL. All right, so there's the URL. If I click on this, watch what changes. See how it added that fragment? And then if I look at this element here, that's linking to that fragment, and that has an ID of syntax. So Sean, what is a fragment?
This is going to be a tail end of a URL that can take us directly to a portion of a page.
Beautiful. So when you get really wild with this, another thing that you can do is just use that to send more data in the URL. So one of the things that I'm doing right now is, by default, all the images in the LMS display at the same size. I can add a fragment to the end of the URLs that say something like medium, and you can target fragments with CSS. And I go, anything that has this fragment, I want you to show half width. But the purpose of a fragment is to link to a part of a page.
Now, how we get to this fragment in our source code, does it need to be identified, such as with an ID tag?
Yeah, it is specifically looking for an element that has that ID.
And it has to be ID. It can't be class.
Has to be ID. And IDs are, it'll match the first ID that it finds. IDs are supposed to be unique on a page. If there would ever be occasion that it would show up more than once, it's not an ID.
hate these pins, you guys.
All right, one more part to the URL. I'm going to throw this out to anyone.
Parameter.
Ooh, yes, it's the thing that you're talking about, but it's got a specific name.
A query string.
Query string.
Query string. Starts with a question mark. Keys, values. If you have more than one, they're separated by ampersands. Query string. What's query string for? Anyone?
This is a guess, but is it for Java?
No. Well, like JavaScript, you mean?
Yeah, JavaScript.
Yeah,
sorry, JavaScript.
you can pull things out of there in JavaScript. That is true. Anything else we know about query strings?
This is another guess, but I mean, query means to search, right? So isn't it like a way to find a specific page, maybe?
Yeah.
It's to search something. I mean.
So I would say, like, yeah, and the JavaScript utility that gets you those is called search params. So good instinct. So these are things that are part of the URL, and they usually modify your request in some way. For example, I might want a list of products, so I ask for products.html, but I want it to be filtered by only red ones. And so I can add a query string on that that says like color equals red. And then I can pull those out with JavaScript and go, oh, don't show everything on the list, just filter it down to the red ones. So it's a way to get data to a page so that you can further customize the page.
Doesn't SQL work in the same way?
Yep. But this is all in the browser. So
right.
You might say, hey, I want the color equals red. And then with JavaScript, you can go, hey, server, can you give me all of the products that are red? And then the server goes, hold on, let me ask the database real quick. And then SQL does a where clause, where color equals red. So those are all the parts to URLs. Ask me some questions about them.
Wait, so I have one question. So in like let's say a more standardized link, like your Seek Education webpage here.
Sure.
The .com at the end of, that's included in the domain, not the path, right? That's technically
correct. And actually, it's even separate from that. Like, it is part of the domain. It is also its own thing called the
TLD.
There we go. Top level domain. These, so like .com is a top level domain. So is .net, .org, .edu. All of those are top level domains. Those are administered by companies that sell you real estate on those, basically. So .com is owned by a company called VeriSign. So if you want KyleCoverly.com, you go to VeriSign, or more likely one of their resellers, like Name.com or GoDaddy or something like that. And you go, hey, I'd like to buy this. And then you have to give VeriSign $20 every year. But yes, that's all part of the domain, not part of the path. More questions about this?
With every website, what is the meaning of like :/ like what does that signify?
That it's a protocol.
Okay.
FTP is FTP://. In practice, like, it's just weird, which makes it easier to, or rather faster for things to detect. So when your computer is trying to break up, or when a server is trying to break apart that URL and figure out what is the scheme, what is the subdomain, what is the domain, weird characters like that make it easier to split off the scheme from the rest of it.
Okay. Thank you.
More questions about URLs? All right, so let's do an inbox thing. Let me pull up inbox if you'd be so kind. Come on. Give me my browser. There we go. All right, I'm going to go somewhere in here. Let's see. Find one of these that has some stuff. All right, let's just do an easy one to start. So I'm in this CSS box model folder, the contents of which look like this. So if I serve this on lite-server, let me type out the question. If I run lite-server from this folder, what will the URL of boxmodel1.png be? All right, questions posted. All right, so looking through these, most of us got the larger strokes of this correctly, but a bunch of you left off the scheme. Scheme is part of the URL. Doesn't always show up in your browser. Sometimes you have to click on it before it'll show that, or it'll tuck it away in some other things. Safari, I think, doesn't even show it anymore. Still part of the URL. So if I do it, lite-server. All right, so this is serving up here. The URL with the scheme is that, and then it was box model 1. Oops. Yep, got it. So that the port number, like any one would be fine. The reason it defaults to 3000. I'm running the LMS on 3000 right now, so it just goes to the next one. Could be whatever.
And then so for this, you don't need Sika example box model, then the image file.
Sorry, say that again.
So for this one, for typing up the URL, you wouldn't have needed the Sika example and then CSS box model.
No. Okay, that's a great question. So this is where it is on my computer. As soon as I run lite-server, this is the root of that server. I can't go any higher than that. I couldn't do something like /./something. Like, that's not allowed. Which is good, because otherwise people could just get random files off my computer. I don't want that. I want to constrain what I'm serving up to this particular folder. So it doesn't know that it's in my home directory and a Sika folder and an examples folder and this CSS box model folder. All the browser knows is that a server is running right here, and any of the files like there on down are served up. Nothing above it.
One other question. So technically there's localhost and then IP, that local IP address. Those are the same answer, right? So
the exact same answer.
Okay, but you have to have the scheme on the front to run the protocol for your domain or localhost. Okay.
Yep. Same thing. This is a little bit of like a mom's basement kind of developer thing, but you'll see this shirt. And now you know what it means.
I love the way you described that.
No, I will not fix your computer. Yes, I know that guac costs extra. Other questions about URLs and what have you? All right, let's go somewhere else and do one more of these. How about perfect? All right, in this folder, looks like this. I want to know if I run lite-server from this folder, what will the URL of index.html be? All right, questions out. What will the URL for index.html be? Good job, Chris. All right, a little bit better. Still quite a bit of variance on this. First thing. So we're getting the scheme more consistently now, but this is just something that you memorize. Local host is always HTTP, not HTTPS. And the reason for that is that HTTPS means that a third party that the server and the client both trust to verify the server's identity agree that that person is who they say they are. There is no third party that will certify that between you and your own computer. So your browser uses HTTP for that. In fact, if you try to use HTTPS, it should bark at you. Yeah. Not a valid URL for that.
Just being like a devil's advocate on this one. When you were showing the example on the last one, you'd put it in as HTTPS.
Oh, did I?
Showing it to
No,
and I almost asked, like, wait, why did you put the S in there? But then I was like, oh, it's okay. But yeah, okay.
Yeah, that's just it's a case of the Mondays. But yeah, localhost is always HTTP. The other thing I'm seeing here, some of you picked up on this. If the thing that you want is the index HTML, let's see, am I serving it up? No, npx lite-server. So I want that index.html file. You also don't need to put the index.html in there. Like, that works. That's the same thing. But if that's the one that you want, if you leave it off, it's what it'll give you anyway, because it's the default. Do not need to include the CSS declarations part. Why? Who can tell me?
The 3001 serves as your root directory.
Ding, 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 ding. Since it's being served from here, it doesn't know or care that it is in that folder. That becomes the root of the server. So, like, maybe another way to visualize that is like, we've got on my computer up to home, Kyle, Sika, some site. Slash some folder, index HTML. Okay, so if that's like what the path looks like on my computer, like it's all my computer up to there, at which point that becomes the like served files. So that's the root. This is the root of my computer. This is the root of the server that I'm hosting. Otherwise, the paths work exactly the same way as they do on your computer.
So for your written example, it'd be localhost 3001 / some folder / index HTML for the path.
You are correct.
This might be a dumb question, but in my answer I put 3002 because we still had another browser pulled up, but
oh sure, yeah, don't overthink it.
Okay.
Like that's just automatically allocated by lite-server. So if I do another one, it'll do 3003, but they're arbitrary. So like if we used HTTP server instead of, which is an alternative to lite-server that doesn't do auto refreshing, That one defaults to 8080 and then 8081 and then 8082. Like there are some specific meanings to a couple of those port numbers, but anything in the 3000 range, anything in the 8000 range, you can kind of just use however you want.
Okay.
More questions? So we talked about finding an IP address. We talked about benefits of lite-server. Like the live server extension's fine. I think this is a lot better. I'd recommend you use lite-server. There are also other ones like Python's simple HTTP, which I don't think is very good. But if you use a Mac, it's already installed, so people will use that a lot. There's all kinds of different ways to do this. Setting up a WAMP server or a MAMP server or a ZAMP server. I think lite-server is probably the easiest way with the best logging, most features kind of stuff. We've talked about parts of a URL. We've talked about how to use lite-server, and we've talked about building URLs. We did this client-server diagram. Client is somebody who requests something. Server is someone who responds to something. That is contextual, so you can be a server in one situation and a client in another situation. Talked about different kinds of file servers. We talked about when we serve a folder, that makes that folder the root of the server, even though it's still on your computer, but otherwise paths kind of work the same way. Talked about localhost always being HTTP, and yeah, final questions.
Throughout our readings, I actually haven't seen what a description of a server actually is, and I would hate to be wrong.
Well, there you go. I'm going to make a note of that.
I mean, it mentions servers, but it doesn't give us a description, and I can Google it and see these rooms, and it's like, it's a bunch of machines that
sure.
retrieves from a database, and that seems like a lackluster explanation.
There you go. Server's just somebody who listens for requests and responds to them. Request for a file, request for data, request to send an email, request to get an email, request to print a document. All those are servers.
So if we're talking about let's say what the server room looks like for my at-home bookstore, it could take up the space of this desk. Meanwhile, the server for Amazon takes up whole warehouses.
Actually,
is this dealing with the amount of data that a server can retrieve, or is there something else going on?
Let me go get a server for you real quick. I'll be right back.
The AT&T servers was a whole underground office, and when it was bombed and flooded, nobody had access to their cell phones, nor could anyone who had AT&T Wi-Fi even access internet for 5 days. It was crazy around here.
I have a friend who works at Verizon, and they said people to this day still come there who did have AT&T, but claim that ever since that explosion, their stuff just hasn't worked the way it used to, which is crazy.
All right. This is a server. Anybody recognize it?
It's like a motherboard.
Is that a Raspberry Pi?
It's a Raspberry Pi. Raspberry Pi is a pretty good server for a lot of. It can handle a pretty decent amount of web traffic, actually. So, yeah, they don't need to be huge. They don't need to be big racks and rows and whatever else. This is a totally adequate server. And I have, for real, hosted a website out of my basement on this thing before. Totally doable.
And so that's literally the machine. It's hooked up to a computer first and then stored elsewhere, and it just auto runs itself. You don't even need a GUI or anything to work it.
It's got a It takes an SD card with the operating system and the files. Like that's effectively its hard drive. Plugs in with a USB-C thing. It's got a little Ethernet port on it. And yeah, it doesn't have a screen or anything, but I use the command line. Once it's on my network, I can log into it. I can put files there. I can look at logs. I can do whatever I need to. And then, yeah, otherwise, I have to set up my router so that when a request comes in from the outside on port 443 or whatever, I need to forward that over to this little computer on my network and have it look for files that are being hosted and whatever else. Then that's going to take the contents of those files and send them back, and that's all a server does.
Cool. Thank you.
Servers can be super big, but what those usually are is like one monster machine that has like 500 fake servers on it. They just split up the resources in there. Like that's how Amazon works. When you get a server on Amazon, you're not getting a box. You're getting like access time on this like matrix. Like that's the cool technological breakthrough that AWS was, is that they're not physical machines. They're not even virtual machines. It is one computer that pretends to be a ton of computers, and then you buy like seconds. You rent seconds and minutes of processing time on them. It's pretty cool. But like your perception of it is exactly like it's not different administering an AWS server and administering this. Like they seem identical on the command line.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah. More questions?
So when, I don't know, like I heard about Parler, how they were not being allowed to use a server.
Mm-hmm.
Is it because their database is so large they have to use like someone like AWS in order to put their website on the, like, I guess I can't remember exactly what happened, but they were like not letting them have their website on the Amazon server.
Sure.
And so they couldn't put their website up because of it.
So like anybody that's providing those services to you can say like, no, we don't want that content. Find someone else. And so if all of the commercial services say that, then you need to have someone who can set up these. And it's probably not like, oh, the database is so big. The problem is more that like, all right, well, if there's a lot of traffic, how do you handle that much traffic? Because like not that big a deal with my like $100 a month Comcast plan to get like a few hits a day on something like this. If you're doing massive traffic like that, then you need a bigger connection to your ISP. Your ISP starts noting that you're getting a lot of traffic on port 80 and goes, hey, wait a minute, you have to sign up for one of our commercial plans. And you have to be somewhere that has like a pipe to your ISP that has enough throughput. So that's like, if you've ever heard of like a T1 line or something like that, it's like a physical connection between you and the ISP rather than that circles within circles diagram I was doing, where it's like, oh, well, I'm connected to my neighborhood and my neighborhood is connected to like the Central Park area of Denver, which is connected to Denver. You need like an actual line that goes right there. So it does not surprise me that they were unable to find somebody that was willing to manage all that infrastructure themselves. Also, this is the thing that's cool about cloud providers, is that used to be a barrier to entry to starting an internet company. You got to have somebody that can manage all of that infrastructure. Well, you don't anymore. Like IT departments, like fuck, at the beginning of my career, we had this huge IT department, and I wanted a server for an app that I was building. I had to fill out paperwork in triplicate. It was a 6-week process. They had to order like computer parts from CDW. There was people whose job it was to assemble them and set them up and set up a username and password for me, like all that kind of shit. Anymore, that's like a 5-second go to AWS, give me a server, and then you have it, and you're done. So the flattening of all the infrastructure requirements on that makes it so that your startup costs for just trying something are like zero. I mean, they're literally zero. It's like all these services have very generous free tiers. So that makes it way more accessible for like 1 or 2 people to run huge businesses. And if they're making good money, then that covers their like AWS bill. Hell of a lot better than like having to hire an entire infrastructure team before you can even get started. Other questions?
How much traffic can that Raspberry Pi actually handle?
Like a fair sum. So like when you're thinking about server capacity, concurrency is the thing you're always worried about. How many concurrent requests can I do? But like on the web, request concurrency is crazy low, like usually. I doubt that the LMS has had more than like 2 concurrent requests like since we started. Because think, when you request something and then it gets served back to you, that's it. Like 2 of those things need to be happening at the same time. So if that gets served in 20 milliseconds or something like that, you need so much traffic that those are like stacking up on each other. I'll bet one of these could probably handle, for web requests, I don't know, 100 concurrent at a time. That's a lot.
Just a general comment. I think Discord's down right now.
Uh-oh.
So something to keep in mind.
Yikes. All right. Anything else?
Hey, just to let you know, my computer is going to do a automatic restart in 13 minutes.
All right.
But I did have one